Hi, guys. Welcome back to another day of the Cold War. We're going to continue to explore the origins. This is actually the Cold War Origins Part 2. I want to start by you reminding me of um, who coined or who used the phrase or first invented the phrase the Iron Curtain. And what was the Iron Curtain? Well, if you said Winston Churchill is who coined the phrase, you are correct. He was the British Prime Minister. And the Iron Curtain, if you'll remember, was the boundary that was dividing Europe in half. Well, not really in half, because half refers to equal parts, but it divided Europe from the end of World War I in 1945 until the end of the Cold War, which did not end until 1991. This boundary kind of represented this Iron Curtain were communist countries on one side for the most part and democratic countries on the other, or capitalist countries. That's kind of what we have moving forward as the conditions in Europe right now. So let's start for today. U.S. containment. The U.S. Soviet relations continued to get worse in 1946 and 1947. An increasingly worried United States tried to offset the growing Soviet threat to Eastern Europe. President Truman, who you see right here, adopted a foreign policy called containment. And it was a policy directed at blocking Soviet influence and stopping the expansion of communism. So, containment policies included forming alliances and helping weak countries resist those Soviet advances. So, if you'll remember, when Germany was divided up and the countries that the Soviet Union had helped to liberate, remember that Stalin made a promise that he was going to allow those countries to continue under their form of government. However, we know now that that's not true, that they actually became satellites of the Soviet Union and were under the communistic rules. So, the Truman Doctrine um, was developed by Harry Truman, and they were policies that supported countries that rejected communism. So it's like, okay, if you reject communism, the United States is going to help you. We're gonna support you. So it caused a lot of controversy though, because some opponents actually objected to American interference in other nations' affairs. In other words, they felt like the Americans were sticking their nose in a business that wasn't theirs. Others, though, argued that the United States could not afford to carry on a global crusade against communism. So the Truman Doctrine was first used with both Greece and Turkey. Now, Greece and Turkey were under the threat of falling to communism. So Truman and Congress sent them $400 million in aid to help those two countries resist. The Marshall Plan was after the end of World War II. Europe was in just complete shambles. There had been so much bombing and so much war that Europe was just a complete mess of ruins. So there was a lot of economic turmoil also because there weren't a lot of jobs and there wasn't a lot of food. So in 1947, the United States Secretary of State, George Marshall, proposed that the United States give aid to needy European countries. Now, if you'll remember, the United States, because the only place that we had any attack on our homeland was in Hawaii. So our country itself wasn't in ruin and our industry kind of picked back up. So this assistance program was called the Marshall Plan, and it's going to provide food and machinery and other materials to help Western Europe rebuild. As Congress debated the $12.5 billion program in 1948, the communists took power. They seized Czechoslovakia. Now, Congress immediately voted approval after that happened. They were like, oh, that's a bad thing. So the plan was a spectacular success. Even communist Yugoslavia received aid after it broke away from Soviet domination. So then we talk about the Berlin Airlift. And some of you have heard me talk about the Berlin Airlift. Like the Candy Bomber was an example where they talked about the Berlin Airlift. So one of those nations that really benefited from the Marshall Plan was West Germany. And by 1948, American, British, and French leaders had become convinced that Stalin was not going to allow the reunification of Germany. Therefore, the Western Allies prepared to merge their three occupation zones to create a new nation, the Federal Republic of Germany, better known as West Germany. So the western part of Berlin would become a part of West Germany. Remember, Berlin was divided into those four regions just like the rest of Germany, but it was actually located in the middle of East Germany. So it was on the other side of, and you're going to learn about this wall in a minute. So the Soviets responded in 1949 by forming a communist state, the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. Now, hundreds of thousands of Eastern Europeans left their homes in communist-dominated nations, fled to East Berlin, and then crossed into West Berlin. From there, they were able to book a passage to freedom in the United States or Canada or even to Western Europe. So Stalin was upset by this. So he decided to close this escape route by forcing the Western powers to abandon West Berlin. And so when a new German currency was introduced in West Germany, including in West Berlin, Stalin considered the new West Berlin as a threat. So Stalin blocked Allied access to West Berlin. All shipments to the city through East Germany were banned because remember, Berlin was located in the middle of East Germany. So all Stalin had to do was go, nope, you're not allowed to come through my country, even though they had to go through his country in order to get to their own. So the blockade threatened to create severe shortages of food and other supplies needed by the people in West Berlin. So U.S. President Truman didn't want to risk starting a war by using military force to open the transportation route. But he didn't want to give up West Berlin to the Soviet Union either. So West Berlin's 2.1 million people ran out of food in 5 weeks. Great Britain and the United States chose to do an airlift. So American and British officials flew food and supplies into West Berlin for nearly 11 months. So in May 1949, the Soviet Union admitted defeat and lifted the blockade. So we're going to see a video here about this part.
The first face-to-face confrontation of the Cold War was in Berlin. Stalin was determined that the Western Allies should leave, and in June of 1948, he cut all the supply lines into the Allied sectors.
It was very tense, and we knew that, and it got tenser and tenser.
West Berliners had enough food to last a few weeks, enough fuel to last only days.
Truman said in meetings in the Oval Office, and he meant it, we stay in Berlin.
You live with the expectation, I did, that we would be going to war with Russia.
The United States were painted and depicted by official propaganda as the greatest enemy, ready at any hour to drop atomic bomb on Russia.
We were close to a third world war. There were some who were arguing we should leave. It isn't worth it. Get out. Why start a third world war over this city? Others were saying we should send an armored division through and break through by force.
President Truman chose another option. He would supply the beleaguered city by air. It was a gamble. American and British pilots who had once dropped bombs on this city would deliver supplies to Berlin hour after hour, day after day.
We were so busy during the airlift. I was flying 128 hours a month. It's a lot of flying. And we were keeping people alive.
They flew in food and fuel and medicine. They were the lifeline for 2.5 million Berliners. After 11 months, Stalin conceded. Without saying a word, he ended the blockade in May of 1949.
All right. So these conflicts marked the start of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So again, the Cold War is a struggle over political differences carried on by means short of military action or war. So you'll notice that Truman, he did not want to risk starting another war and that being with the Soviets. And so he was trying to take the high road, but to still make sure that the people were taken care of. So beginning in 1949, the superpowers began to use spying and propaganda and diplomacy and secret operations in their dealings with each other. So much of the world allied with one side or the other. In fact, until the Soviet Union finally broke up in 1991, the Cold War dictated not only US and Soviet foreign policy, but it influenced world alliances as well. So the superpowers, like I said, they formed alliances. The Berlin blockade heightened Western Europe's fear of Soviet aggression. They were really afraid that the Soviets were going to continue to try to take over European countries. So as a result, in 1949, 10 Western European nations joined with the US and Canada to form a defensive military alliance. And this was called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or you might have heard it called NATO. An attack on any NATO member would be met with armed force attacks by all member nations. And so, again, it's an alliance. You protect me, I protect you. There's safety in numbers. So naturally, the Soviet Union saw NATO as a threat, and it formed its own alliance in 1955. It was called the Warsaw Pact, and it included the Soviet Union, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. Now, all of those countries were countries that ended up being freed, if you will, by Soviet troops during World War II. So all of these countries were pretty much liberated. That's the word I was looking for. They were liberated by the Soviets. And so whether or not these countries really agreed, I don't really know. But I can think that they were kind of semi-forced into communism and forced into this Warsaw Pact. So in 1961, the East Germans built a wall to separate East and West Berlin. Now, it's called the Berlin Wall, and it symbolized a world divided into rival camps. However, not every country joined the new alliances. Some, like India, chose to not align with either side, and China, the largest communist country, came to distrust. They did not trust the Soviet Union. And so it also remained unaligned.
This nuclear threat over Berlin was diffused, but the Soviet-American confrontation would continue. In October of 1961, the Soviets began building the Berlin Wall. The wall would become a symbol of the Cold War's brutal reality. The newsreels presented Americans with haunting images of people risking their lives to escape communism.
Once a country went communist, it stayed communist. They had secret police and the whole totalitarian structures so that there was no regressing. That the Soviet Union and its allies were a formidable global presence seemed very clear to me.
All right. So now we move to the nuclear threat of war. So this is where they're going to face off. And peace alliances were forming. The Cold War threatened to heat up enough to destroy the world. The United States already had atomic bombs, and in 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its own atomic weapon. So President Truman was determined to develop a more deadly weapon before the Soviets did. So he authorized work on a thermonuclear weapon in 1950. The hydrogen, or the H-bomb, as you guys have probably heard it, would be thousands of times more powerful than the atomic bomb. Its power came from the fusion or joining together of atoms rather than the splitting of atoms as in the atomic bomb. So in 1952, the United States tested the first H-bomb, and the Soviets exploded their own in 1953. Dwight D. Eisenhower became the president of the United States in 1953, and he appointed the firmly anti-communist John Foster Dulles as his Secretary of State. Now, if the Soviet Union or its supporters attacked U.S. interests, Dulles threatened the United States would, quote, retaliate instantly by means and at places of our own choosing. This willingness to go to the edge or the brink of war became known as brinkmanship. Brinkmanship required a reliable source of nuclear weapons and airplanes to deliver them. So the United States strengthened its Air Force and began producing stockpiles of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union, of course, responded with its own military buildup, beginning with an arms race that would go on for decades. It went on for 40 years.
Once we knew the Soviets had the atomic bomb in 1949, it then became, once again, a different world.
Now, we could be a target of an atomic attack and did not trust the Russians. And I do remember this, that you lived day to day with the thought that there could be a nuclear attack on us at any time.
In only 3 years, Americans had gone from buying their first homes to building their first bomb shelters.
And I physically dug out an area underneath that house, right at 6 foot deep, so that the family could at least go there and be below ground level.
All right. So the Cold War also affected science and education programs of both countries. In August of 1957, the Soviets announced the development of a rocket that could travel great distances, an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. So on October 4th, the Soviets used an ICBM to push Sputnik, the first unmanned satellite, above the Earth's atmosphere. Americans felt like they had fallen behind in science and technology, and the government poured money into science and education. In 1958, the United States launched its own satellite. So in 1960, the skies again were another, well, they were another superpower conflict. There we go. Can't get my words out. 5 years earlier, though, Eisenhower had proposed that the United States and the Soviet Union be able to fly over each other's territory to guard against surprise nuclear attacks. And so the Soviet Union said no. And in response, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, started secret high-altitude spy flights over the Soviet Union or Soviet territories in planes called U-2s. So in May of 1960, the Soviets shot down a U-2 plane, and its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured. This U-2 incident heightened Cold War relations. So we're going to watch one more video, but before we do that, well, let's go ahead and watch the video, and then I've got a final thought for you.
We say, attention, all radio stations of the Soviet Union are broadcasting.
The first artificial Earth satellites in the world have now been created. This first satellite was today successfully launched in the US.
This beep, 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 what is it? Sputnik. Sputnik is around the globe. Who did it? We did it. The Soviet Union. First in the space.
And I can remember going out to my backyard one night, looking up at this bright streak going across the sky, and I felt a sudden sinking feeling, one of almost terror.
Now, suddenly, you've got Soviet missiles that can reach into the Dakotas, can hit Chicago.
With a surprise attack possible for the first time, Americans began to look at the sky differently, now as a place from which terror might reign, and to learn some new terms like duck and cover.
I felt that the threat to America had been increased, that the Soviet Union had upped the ante. While we were playing cops and robbers hide and seek in our backyards and our front yards, there was the gnawing anxiety that it could all end instantaneously.
So you can see that the Americans started to fear that there was going to be a nuclear attack from space, because now the United States has fallen behind, and they weren't the first in space. The Soviets were the first in space, and now they've got this satellite, and they've got these ballistic missiles that are capable of going long range, and they can bomb us without ever getting close to us. So it was definitely a terrifying time in the United States around the 1956, 57, 58, right on through like 1964, 65. Although it does continue because the Cold War doesn't end, remember, until 1991. But while the Soviet communists were squaring off against the United States, communists in China were fighting a civil war for control of that country. And so that is what we are going to talk about tomorrow. We're going to look at communism in China. So that's all I have for today. Be thinking about what was the Truman Doctrine, and I'll leave that with you, and have a great rest of your day.